This is of Mountains and Men. I am Rhys Gadbois, and here with me is
Peter Myers.
There we go. We'll get that figured out eventually.
Yeah, maybe.
This is our second episode that we were recording in one day, which is fun.
Yeah, which might mean there might be a little bit less intro or banter or whatever.
Yeah, since we've
this time, since we already kind of did that earlier. But
what banter could we do? Peter took us to this, or took. He suggested.
Rhys drove us because
drove.
I'm legally blind, so technically I can't drive.
Would have been fun if you drove just to see how it went. But
I mean, I have driven.
What? You've driven?
In a parking lot.
In a parking lot, okay.
Yeah.
When was the last time you drove in a parking lot?
When I was in seminary.
Oh, okay. Was this Zach Watson's prompting?
No, actually it wasn't, surprisingly. It was my my classmates, but...
Oh, okay, cool. Nice.
Yeah. Just brief, but... I also drove in the parking lot of the Newman Center back in college at one. Well, no, I think I was out of college, but it was at the parking lot of the Newman Center.
Okay. I see. Nice. Cool. So yeah,
but you were saying we went to Habit Burger, right?
Yeah, went to Habit Burger, a burger place here in Taos.
We are not being
this week's sponsor is Habit
sponsored
Burger.
by yeah, exactly. That's what I was saying. We're not getting any kickback for this, sadly, but.
No, Habit Burger. It was good. Yeah, it was pretty good.
Yeah, what did you actually think? Like, did you like it? I mean, it's okay if you didn't.
No, I did like it. I really did. Yeah, it was a good, clean, fresh burger. It had caramelized onions on it, which
nice. Those
makes
are always good.
Everything good. Like I said, I just got over food poisoning, so it's like,
yeah,
I'm enjoying food, but I'm pretty cautious around it right now.
That's totally
like
fair.
I didn't even finish the fries. Like usually I eat all the burger and all the fries, but I was just like, you know what, my tummy's done. We're gonna call it quits. But no, lunch was good. Lunch was delicious, and now we got all the energy, and we're ready to go.
Yeah, we hope.
So today we're going to talk about. Was our first episode? We talked about worldviews: the existentialist worldview, the nihilist worldview, and then the theistic worldview. And then episode 2, we decided to talk about community, that concept of what makes a good community. And we'll probably come back to these topics, I think, throughout our podcast. But today we're talking about not only we're stepping away from the community, and we're going to talk about the individual. What makes a person good? So that's what it is. What makes a person good?
Wait.
Yeah. Or what makes a good person?
Yes, that's what I was just going to clarify. You mean what makes a good person, right? Not what makes a person good, because what makes a person good would be a different question, I think, actually. But
so how would they differ?
Well, what makes a person good, I would say, is their inherent dignity as someone who's created.
I see. Okay.
In the image and likeness of God. But like, what makes a good person is what we're more planning to address today, as far as like how to live, how an individual should live to be a good person, in a sense, right? Like how they should live their life to pursue like the good.
So when we say what makes a person good, that's a question about value
of the actual person themselves.
Value of the person,
not of their actions or of their.
What makes a good person is a moral question.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Like, are they good? Are they bad? Like, yeah. Okay. Good. That's a good distinction. I love it. Obviously, people are good because we're made in God's image and likeness. I mean, if you don't believe that, good luck.
Yeah.
Good freaking luck thinking anybody's good, honestly. Like, valuable. You can make an argument that we're all equal, but you could also say that we're all equally garbage.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, all garbage is equal, guys. We need to fight for the equal rights of garbage, and that is the right to be thrown in the trash and burned. We're not garbage. Yeah, we have value.
Well, and I think some people make that argument about, like, you know, intelligence and things like that they'll try to divorce it from any concept of God and being created in the image and likeness of God, using like the argument of, well, we're the most intelligent beings and we have, you know, the ability to reason and stuff like that. And it's like, well, it's great, but at the same time, that's still kind of, in one sense, I think falls apart, because if you don't have something to back that, what if, you know, let's say that I would believe this isn't possible, but I'm just saying, in that perception, in that worldview, eventually you could make a computer that's more intelligent than us in a certain sense, and then therefore, why doesn't that computer have more dignity than us as humans? Like, you know, like it's a flawed argument in a sense to say, well, we're intelligent, or we're, valuable in that way. Like that is important, and that's part of our dignity as humans, to be clear. But it's just that's not like the first and foremost thing is.
Well, it's also an
likeness of
argument
God.
from your good insofar as you have something other than yourself.
Oh yeah, exactly. Because like in the I'm thinking of a podcast that I saw a couple months ago where people were discussing this question, and one of the things that came up was like people with mental disabilities or things like that. That like, because if you think about it, if you base it on the ability to think or reason or whatever, what about a human being who has a mental disability?
Right.
Where they can't do those things, then all of a sudden, doesn't that mean that they don't have the same dignity as any other person?
Yeah, I guess someone could respond to that and say, well, in principle, human beings possess the ability to be intelligent. And while some people are lacking in it, that doesn't mean that they lack dignity, because in principle they should be possessing it, but they don't because of some defect. But
yeah, that's fair.
But even then, the problem I have with that argument is still you're determining someone's value based off of something other than themselves. It's like, oh, you're valuable because you possess this thing, and I guess maybe that's the same argument. You think that's the same argument that Christians and Jews are arguing, because we're valuable because we're made in God's image and likeness, which is something other. Well, no.
Well, but no, because that's not something that we.
Because that's not something that's other than ourselves. That is who we are.
Yeah, because it's not something we possess per se, so much as being part of our being.
Yeah.
That like part of our being as human beings is that we are created in the image and likeness of God. Now, part of that image and likeness is intelligence, actually. That's the ability to reason is something that makes us part, because the image and likeness isn't just meant in a literalistic sense. It's not about the physical image per se.
I don't look like God.
Exactly. It's more about the fact that we have the ability to think and to reason and all that. But there's deeper things to that too.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and that perspective kind of sanctifies the idea of reason and intelligence. Yeah, like it's rooted. If it's just by itself, if it's just reason, like so be it. Like, oh, our ability to reason makes us special. Okay, why? Because we can do cool things. Like, okay, that doesn't. Yeah. Why? Yeah. It seems kind of like an argument that is empty when you really get down to the bottom of it. But that's not what we're talking about today.
Yeah. So that was just an aside. Sorry, but getting back to
what makes a good person.
Yes.
Yeah. So, Cephas, my man. Mm-hmm. If anyone ever wonders why I call him Cephas, it's because his name is Peter, and Cephas, that's Aramaic for Peter. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it's Aramaic. It's also Greek, but I think it's Aramaic originally. Yeah.
I thought Greek. Okay, because I thought the Greek for Peter was Petros.
I mean, Petros is Latin.
Petros is Latin.
It might also.
Should we?
We can do it another time, maybe.
I want to embarrass you right now.
I mean, you can try. Although this is going to be really tantalizing for all the listeners. No. Rhys is currently looking this up on his phone to try to prove me wrong.
Maybe we should hire someone to do this stuff for us.
Like Thursday on Matt Frad's podcast. Or what's his face? What's the guy on Joe Rogan's podcast? Jamie, yeah.
Cephas. Oh, I misspelled Cephas. Cephas. So Cephas.
It's Cephas.
Rock. So it's Aramaic.
Okay. Yeah, okay. But there's also Greek for it too. But
Petros. Oh, come on.
Petros should be Latin.
It does have a Latin ending. OS. What is? No, Petros. No, I don't want. There's a place around here called Petros. Apparently.
Petros. That's weird.
Greek.
Well, everyone.
There's a Petros Greek restaurant. What does Petros mean in Greek? Meaning rock stone. So it is Greek.
It's also Latin.
Is Petros Latin? Okay. Well, yeah. There would be. Yeah,
it's the same. It's Greek and Latin.
It's the exact same. Just different participle parts. I'm gonna act like I know what those mean, but I don't. Doesn't St. Augustine complain about Greek while writing his complaint?
I don't know. That's a good question.
I know he hates Greek.
Wait, didn't he write in Latin though? Like, wasn't the Confessions written in Latin?
I think the Confessions was written in Latin, and he does talk about his love of Latin in the Confessions, but I think he talks about his hatred of Greek, even though he knows it.
I mean, Greek is definitely more complicated than Latin, and
Yeah.
Latin's pretty complicated. So
Yeah.
I've taken some of both. So,
Western Church rules. So,
but anyway, yeah. So
what makes a good person? So, Peter and I were talking about this a little bit during lunch at Habit Burger. Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
And the answer I gave for what makes a good person, not a person who's good, but a good person, is someone who lives their life in accordance with the good. Because that's what this podcast is about, is
exactly
the
it's
good
living. Yeah.
and trying to live in accordance with it.
Yep.
Now, so that's it. That's today's episode. I hope you guys liked it. No, obviously there's a lot
All
more
right.
to
This
say.
was of Mountains and Men.
This was a Mountains and Men.
No, just kidding.
Like, yeah, there's obviously a lot more to say about that. Like, it's not that simple.
Well, I think the most important thing about that is, what does it mean to live in accordance with the good? To me, that's the question that we then have to, like, the logical next step.
Mm-hmm.
You can say that a good person is someone who lives in accordance with the good. Well, okay, great. We're just using words, but like, what does that mean on a more practical level?
Yeah. Well, how do you think someone would live their life in accordance with the good?
Yeah, I mean, I think to me it comes down to, again, like, we've been using Aristotle a lot in our first couple episodes, and I think, again, we can kind of reference Aristotle here a little bit, of thinking about, as we've talked about, like, what it means to pursue the good. If we think of the good as being, in Aristotelian words, again, good would be like eudaimonia, that like Greek word that means like happiness, but in a more like ecstatic, existential sense of like this profound sense of happiness, deeper than just like the emotion of happiness, but like almost like joy, maybe, in a certain sense.
Yeah, fulfillment.
Fulfillment, yes, yeah. Exactly. That's a good way to put it. But how do you get there? I think one of the ways that Aristotle would suggest is through living virtue, which we talked about a little bit last time, of the virtue being the mean, the middle between the deficit and the excess. And so I think that's where one of the things we can talk about today a little bit is some of the virtues, in a sense, to kind of dive into some of these different virtues that we talk about on a regular basis as people, or as a world, or as Christians, and what it means to live those virtues and how to live those virtues a little bit, because I think those are some of the most important recipes or some of the most important pieces of the recipe of how to live the good, how to pursue the good.
Just to ask for some clarification.
Yeah.
And we might have talked about this during the first episode, but Aristotle, the reason he came to the conclusion that virtue is what will make us happy is based off of his teleological understanding of a human being, right?
Yeah.
And so for those listening, teleological is rooted in the word telos, and telos just means end goal or purpose. So when we say teleological understanding, we're saying with the end goal of a human being in mind.
Yep.
And so Aristotle asked, what is the purpose of a human being? And the way he discerned that was by looking at what a human being is. And the way he defines a human being is as a rational animal, correct? Mm-hmm. So therefore, a human being is a rational animal. Therefore, a human being finds its fulfillment in living in accordance with reason.
Yes.
And reason seems to be used, or when it is used properly, it is used to tame our animalistic characteristics.
Yeah.
Right. So I think, because like we said, like you perfectly said, virtue is the mean between two extremes. We're like a horse, we're a stallion that has these emotions, and they're animalistic, and we need to tame them. And what do we tame them with? We tame them with reason itself. And if we tame everything with reason enough, then we'll be happy. Is basically
exactly. Yeah. And I think that's a great
we'll be good
foundation that you're building there, because that's important. Like I just said, the things about virtue without that foundation, and it might be hard to understand that in a certain sense. So I think the foundation you're saying is so important, because I think a great example of that is, and to be clear too about the, as you called them, animalistic elements, they aren't necessarily bad though. That's the important distinction.
Yeah. Because
I think people can sometimes hear that and think that it's like the old school way of looking at it, of like, oh, well, our animalistic like tendencies or appetites, and we have to tame them and get rid of them. But that's not necessarily true. They're not bad automatically. And I think a great example of that would be like food is a great example of that, in some sense, that we need food to survive. as human beings. And we can even get pleasure out of food at times, which is great. But also Aristotle would propose that that would be a great example of a way that we can live virtuously, is to only eat the food that we need to survive, and then sometimes for pleasure perhaps, but not to the extent that we're going so far as gluttony on one extreme, or not to starve ourselves, except for obviously there's exceptions in the sense of like Christian fasting or Muslims fast in some cases, or people like that do, and Jewish people. There's cultures and stuff that'll fast for various specific reasons, but in general, to not be like depriving ourselves of the nutrients that we need would be a deficit. But then on the other hand, the excess, of course, would be if we're gluttonously eating, massive amounts of sweets and alcohol and whatever else all the time, and like just abusing our bodies in a sense because we're having all these things we don't need. That's an example of like, there's a middle ground there of like having a reasonable amount of good food and that's healthy in the sense of good. And then also sometimes you can have, a dessert or a drink or whatever that are like nice things that you can kind of indulge in, but they're not to the excess.
Yeah. So you were speaking of the animalistic tendency, the appetite for food.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
An animalistic tendency. So I've heard of stories where someone was on vacation and they left their dog at home and they left just the bag of dog food open. But some dogs will just eat themselves to death.
Yep.
They will not stop. Have you ever seen, like, if you've ever given food to a dog and it just attacks its food?
Oh, yeah.
If you gave it the whole bag, it would chow the whole thing down. But that will kill it, just like overeating will kill anybody.
Yep.
But the animal has what we call an instinct to continuously do that, an animalistic tendency. We possess that instinct as well, but we have the gift of reason, which can tell us, don't do that, even though you kind of want to.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many bags of Sour Patch Kids I've eaten, like the whole thing, when I just should not have.
Oh,
But I'm
yeah.
like, let's just have like a little like small handful, and then like you're like, let's have a second small handful because that's like one big handful, and we'll call it good. And then like 10 minutes goes by, you're like, the bag's almost empty. Let's just finish it.
Yeah. Yep.
It's clearly not good for you. So, we have animalistic tendencies like the appetite for food, and we use our reason to tame that. And that is how we become a good person. Now, Aristotle understood that as virtuous life, using reason to tame ourselves, is what would make us happy.
Yep.
I think that's insufficient. Do you think it's insufficient? Like on its own,
A virtuous life.
I'm not discrediting it. No, not his understanding of a virtuous life.
No. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. You're saying that like what is insufficient is that a virtuous life is merely using virtue to tame our appetites properly and to direct them well toward the good.
Yeah, I think
insufficient.
I think it's good to do those things, and I think happiness requires doing those things, because clearly you're not happy when you're enslaved to your animalistic passions. Like, you'll die, you'll be overweight, or too skinny, not have enough energy. Just for an example. So clearly, to be happy, you need to be in the middle. You need to tame these things.
Yeah.
But
So why do you think that's insufficient? I'm curious.
Because it's not all encompassing. Like it's not the end all be all.
Well, yeah, I think what I think of in that is the deeper question has to be asked there to me, kind of similar to me asking you the question of what does it mean to, for the good person to live virtuously or whatever. Well, the other question I think that you could ask is what exactly is the good? Like, what is it that you're pursuing in that good? In which case, does that mean that you need more than just virtue? Right? Because what is the good?
You also have to ask ourselves, are we even capable of living a truly virtuous life under our own efforts? Like, are we capable of always being tame?
I don't know the answer to that. That's a really interesting question, actually.
Like, I can think of like my grandmother. I think she's pretty tame. It's weird to speak of my grandmother like this. Shout out to Grandma G. That she's pretty tame. She's very temperate. Wonderful woman. She's gonna be a saint. But most people aren't my grandma. No, and I don't think everyone has the ability to be like my grandma. And also I think my grandma is the way she is because of not only just her own efforts. like Aristotle. What I'm saying is, what his argument for what makes a good person, it makes sense. I think what he says is true. I just don't think that's all of it. I think, like you said, we have to ask ourselves the question: well, what is the good that we're working towards? Are we just doing this for its own sake? Are we just trying to be good people for the sake of being good
exactly.
people?
And I think what I think of when you're bringing this up is like the examples of the really virtuous like people out there today who don't have much of a concept of God. And like the ones that come to mind for me are like, and I like these guys, to be clear. I just think that they're kind of like we're talking about right now. I think they're just lacking one thing in a sense, is like the Jocko Willink, if you know who that is.
Yeah, I was thinking of Jordan Peterson, but he makes sense too.
Oh yeah, Jordan Peterson is great too. Yeah. And there's another one that I'm forgetting, but another like former like Marine or whoever it is.
David Goggins.
Yes, Goggins. That was the other one I was thinking of. Man. That like Goggins and Jocko Willink and like Jordan Peterson are these great examples of these men. Now, granted, I almost would put Peterson in a little bit of a different category because Peterson, the last few years especially, has been like pursuing, like has been reading scripture a lot, and seems like he's like drawing a lot closer to God, publicly at least, than it even seems like those other guys are.
His wife became Catholic.
I know, it's beautiful.
That's freaking awesome.
But so like Jocko and Goggins, though, I think are two great examples of guys who live virtue overall, at least perceptibly, publicly, very well. But I think to your point, they're still missing one element, which is the most important element, of course, I would argue, but which is like that specific thing of, are they living virtue well just to be like good humans in a sense? Or is there a supernatural element that needs to be understood and perceived for us as humans that is, okay, well, we're living virtue well, not merely so that we're good humans in this life, but so that we're good stewards of our, as we talked about it earlier, being made in the image and likeness of God, that if we understand that as being an important element of this, then we need to be good stewards of that image and likeness and live virtue well to live the good life so that we can attain heaven, hopefully, so that we can get to that final end, that telos, like Aristotle's talking about. And Aristotle might not have had that perception of the telos, but there is, he does have a telos. It's just slightly different.
Yeah.
So what do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that's actually a good point, because I think we should talk about that a little bit more. We didn't plan on it, but so be it. We kind of live in the age of self-help books and self-help demigods. And I think Jocko Willink is a self-help demigod. He says good things. And I think the reason people are so impacted by what Goggins, Peterson, Andrew Huberman, if you've ever heard of him, he's a neuroscientist, awesome guy. I actually want to talk about him a little bit more. But these guys, like, first of all, if you look at the world, like, we're super sad, we're super stressed, we're super afraid, and we're also super unhappy because of all of this. And we ask ourselves, why are we so unhappy? How do we make ourselves happier? And the things like, hey, be temperate, are just kind of like obvious answers. They're not so obvious, but when you start doing them, they clearly work. You just feel better when you don't stay up till midnight every night. You just feel better when you sleep well. You feel better when you eat better. You feel better when you consume good content, like you're reading and not just watching shows nonstop. Okay, like there's a time and place for that, but when you're not just doing that, you feel better. So I think when you look at people like Jocko Willink, his teachings have such a big impact on people, and they feel better. But I think you're eventually going to get to the point where you ask yourself, okay, I feel better, but now what?
Yeah.
Because you're never going to, like this, what's the word, Aristotle?
Eudaimonia.
Eudaimonia. Like, I don't think any of us really feel that just because they changed their diet, developed better sleeping habits, and started consuming good things other than food. I think we're still left with like, okay, now what else is there?
Yeah, and I think you see that with a lot of those type of things out there nowadays, with a lot of the self-help things or the Jocko Willinks or the people like that, of like people will pursue virtue in that way, but then what happens is they're pursuing virtue as an end rather than pursuing the end, the telos of, a relationship with God, let's say, and using virtue as a means to that end. It almost becomes virtue because you see that one of the ways you see it nowadays, of course, is the massive uptick in fitness things nowadays. You know, like how going to the gym is almost like a religion for some people, where like they will spend hours and hours a day in the gym, and that's good in a certain sense, insofar that like it's good to be healthy, it's good to take care of ourselves in that way. But if are we going to the gym for the purpose of building virtue, for the purpose of becoming a better person in relation to God and charity and others? Or are we going to the gym merely to, again, similar to a conversation we had in our last episode a little bit about, you know, why we're doing things? Is it just to be the best at, you know, this virtue, or the best at, you know, the most fit or whatever? Like, that's where that telos is so important behind people's actions.
Yeah, because you also have to acknowledge the fact that each and every one of us is going to likely get to the point where we no longer feel good. We're going to get old.
Yes.
Like, oh, I changed my diet. Oh, I'm consuming good stuff. Your body's going to break down.
Yeah.
It's just a fact of nature. So that's why I've been reflecting a little bit more lately on, not lately, when I say lately, I mean like the past couple of years, about why older people tend to be more religious than younger people. And always people always give the easy answer of, oh, they're just closer to death and they don't want to live a life without meaning, so they accept God.
And they have more time on their hands because many of them are retired or things like that. Yeah,
right.
That's an argument I've heard too.
Sure, I'm sure that is a part of it. But if you want to straw man their recent conversion, by all means, go ahead. But you're probably wrong. You have to. Things are so much more complicated than we like to make them seem nowadays. We like to simplify things with like one-shot answers, but sorry, reality just does not work that way. So, yeah, I'm sure there's some truth to what people are saying as to why people make these later in life conversions. But I think it's also the fact that they've realized happiness still has to be an option for me, and my body, the pleasure I receive via the body is no longer the answer, because it's just not an option anymore. Yeah. So there has to be something else other than that can make me happy. And sure, you can still be a good person, I think, with a broken down body by being virtuous, by just being charitable and loving towards others. Because there's virtue in our relationship to food and our consumption of goods and how we treat our body. But there's also virtue in relationship to how we like treat others. I mean, that's what our last episode was about.
Well, and I think that gets into something. You and I have both now used this word, and I think it's probably important that we kind of define it a little bit, because I'm realizing in this conversation that one of the elements is that, and I think this is one of the flaws in today's thing too, is today as in the world today, is virtue for the sake of purely the individual isn't actually that virtuous in a certain sense, and doesn't actually like help that much.
Yeah, the French Revolution proved that.
Because to the point that we've both now used the word charity a couple of times, or charitable or whatever, you know, variations on it. And I think it's important to recognize that now we both as Catholics have a very clear like Thomistic view of charity. But even Aristotle had, you know, as we talked about in our last episode about friendship and community and all that, Aristotle had very much an understanding of charity that was formed by this concept of doing the good for the other, of living well for the sake of others, not merely for ourselves. And I think that's a really important element of all this, because to the point you just made about the, you know, the older people who might get, you know, they later in life they've become more religious or whatever. I think part of that too is probably, to your point, is that they've as you get older, in my experience with a lot of people I've talked to and stuff, I think there's even more of a recognition of the importance of others, of the fact that our own happiness in a certain sense, like it might seem paradoxical in one sense because it almost seems selfish, but like the more that we give of ourselves to others in a certain sense, the happier it will make us. And so the more that we live for others in a certain sense, in this paradoxical sense, the better we will feel ourselves. And that's something that I think is also important to recognize, because you can be the most virtuous person in the world in a certain sense, but if you're doing all those things because you believe that this is best for me and I'm going to make myself really happy by doing all these things, well, okay, great. But then like, what about everyone around you? Are you spending so much time practicing that virtue, quote unquote, like the gym example. Like, are you spending 3 hours a day in the gym and neglecting to spend a lot of time with friends and family? Like, and I'm not trying to take a crap on people who go to the gym. That's like, I think it's great overall, but I'm just using that as an example. But the point is, like, where are we investing our time? How are we doing things in relation to others? I think is very important too.
Yeah. I mean, even with that, you can make the argument of giving yourself to others, being charitable towards others. If you're doing that just to make yourself happy, is even charitable at that point? It's kind of like, isn't that Kant's view of virtue? Everyone really does. I'm not sure if it's Kant, but
Well, I think there's okay. So I think I think I'm getting into like that gets into a little bit of like a really deep distinction, because I'm not necessarily saying that you're doing it for the sake of making yourself happy, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that, like, it's not, you will probably feel good in
as a
doing that,
consequence, I see
and
it,
that's
yeah.
not a bad thing. That was more what I was trying to get at, because most people who do charitable actions do feel good about those charitable actions, and there's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't make you selfish to do that, I think, was the point that I'm trying to get at.
I see.
But yes, you're right. You shouldn't do charitable things merely for the sake of making yourself happy. That's not good either. It should be for truly the sake of the other.
Right.
But I think that inherently in doing something for the sake of the other, we're often going to feel a sense of fulfillment or happiness or whatever from doing that.
Yeah. No, that's good. That's good. So what do we have so far? We're trying to be good people. We're good people by being virtuous. Virtuous is to live a life in accordance with the good. These are all good things. The self-help worldview, caring for others, even, that's all great. But what else? Like, is that enough? Like you keep mentioning this need for God as well to be a good person. How does that, like, why do we need that extra step? Why do we need God to be happy? Why do we need God to be good?
I mean,
couldn't we just do away with God and still be good and happy?
I mean, I would say no, but I think more importantly, it's because of that relationship. Because if we take the thing of being created in the image and likeness of God, there's also the aspect that God created us for a relationship, with each other and with Him. And I think that's, we can see there's clear evidence that we're relational beings.
Yeah.
Merely in the way that we interact as humans. And again, referencing our last episode, if you think about the concept of how we interact with each other in friendship and in community, it's very relational. And you see it even today in our world of the different gradations of interactions versus, like you and I right now are sitting across from each other at a table. And so we can have we can actually see each other's body language and stuff like that. Somebody who's listening to us can only hear us. They can't see our body language.
Yeah.
And that makes it even harder. And so there's that relational aspect. And as Catholic Christians, like, there's obviously an understanding as well for us that we are created for a relationship with God, that God creates us out of love to have a relationship with Him. And therefore, that, I think, is like the ultimate, that has to be the ultimate telos, the ultimate end of our practice of virtue, of our life of the good, is to be in relation to God. And that takes different forms. On earth here, that means having a prayer life. And kind of, if you think about from the scriptures, like, what are the two greatest commandments that are asked to Jesus? And Jesus responds to love God with your whole heart, soul, and mind and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Mm-hmm. And so those two things that's where charity, properly understood, is not doing the good for the other for the sake of yourself, to your point. It's doing the good for the other for the sake of the other. Mm-hmm. It's doing it for the sake of love of the other and love of God, love of God and love of neighbor. Like, those are the two kind of ends.
I also think if anyone who's listening is, like, struggling to understand, okay, I see why we need to be virtuous. I see why just caring for ourselves is insufficient. We have to care for others to be happy, to be a good person. and maybe if whoever's listening is like struggling to understand, okay, well, why do we need God for that? That might take a long conversation to have to understand that. But if you look at history, every time God is taken out of the equation, people stop caring about others. People cease to be charitable. People cease to be happy and tend to be more violent. And you could be thinking to yourself, okay, well, religion has caused a lot of issues, certainly. I'm like, yeah, it sure has. Bad religion definitely has. Have you ever seen the movie The Man Who Became Pope about?
Oh yeah, of course.
I love that movie.
I just St. John Paul II.
Yeah, really good. Yeah. I mean, acting is a little cheesy.
Oh, I love that movie anyway.
But it's a good story.
I think it's so well done.
And the guy who plays Karol Wojtyla just kills it.
He does, yeah.
And there's a scene where he's debating with a communist. And Carol is kind of giving the communist a hard time about how he's treating people. And the communist responds with, well, look how your church is. How did your church treat the Native Americans? And Carol responded, they treated them in an unchristian way.
Yeah.
Which is him acknowledging, yeah, the church screwed up. The church did not act like the church. So when the church ceases to act like the church, yeah, that proves our point. That once you remove God from the situation, whether or not you still believe in him or do, people who believe in God remove him from their lives constantly. That's what sin is.
Yeah.
Every time God is removed from the situation, it just does not work out well historically by any means at all. So I think just based off of history, in order for us to be happy, and this is why Dr. Peterson, Jordan Peterson says, he's not sure if he believes in God, but he's afraid he does exist, and he lives as if God exists. Because he clearly sees that if you remove God from the equation, it just does not go well. Because every human being clearly has this void for something above ourselves to subscribe to and believe in. And that's why everyone nowadays is talking about the universe. Oh, the universe patted me on. The universe helped me out today. Oh, the universe has greater things in store for me. It's like it's the same thing, buddy.
Yeah.
You know, you can't personify the universe without calling it God.
It's like the Force in Star Wars. Like,
yeah, it has a will. If you're speaking of something having a will, it's a person.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a thirst for God to help us better explain why we need to be good, or to even give us a reason why to be good. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Because I think, again, it gets back to a little bit of that conversation that I think we've had before of if we're being good, if we don't have like what happens if you don't have something outside of yourself drawing you to be good, like inviting you to be good, then doesn't it just become what you think is good or what I think is good? Well, if it becomes that, then there is no universal good. And so then eventually you end up with this thing, well, okay, then why should we be good?
Well, that's also, yeah, you can see the stages. That's when the violence ensues, is when the person, because there's this God-filled gap in everybody's life, and something's going to fill it.
Yeah.
So the question is what fills it? Some people call it the universe, which the universe is really whatever they want it to be. Okay.
Yeah.
But what really most people, and Christians included, they put themselves in that place of God, and they become their own God, which is exactly what the Garden of Eden was all about when Adam and Eve extended their arms and grabbed the fruit, and the devil said, if you eat of this, you will be like gods. That's what all of sin is. That's what all anti-virtue is. It's vice. It's me saying, I am God, and I will tell myself what is good, which is Nietzsche's theory of the Übermensch. But
yeah,
that's going to lead to these consequences, like you said. It's going to lead to the violence. That's what's happening when the Christians act unchristian-like, and that's what happens when people reject God entirely and decide to say that they have the answer to happiness.
Well, and again, I think this is another point to me. This is something I've reflected on a lot the last few years that I think happens in our world again a lot today, is this concept of you be the one who makes the change in your life. Like, you need to be the master of your life. And like, it's funny because that's really close to being right. Insofar that, to the point that we've been talking about, we should live virtue. and we should do our best that we can as humans to try to practice virtue. And that's good. But there's that little external element of like, if it becomes all about me, then like at some point, to your point, it's going to end up kind of devolving almost into like, well, what do you think is virtuous? What do you think is good? Versus if you have that outside understanding. And that's where like the weird paradox for Christians comes in a little bit of living virtue also requires surrendering to God on some level. And that seems counterintuitive in some sense, because part of the point of virtue is that you're like practicing something well. But in our Christian understanding of it, that surrender allows for God to help us live virtue.
Well, yeah, this goes back to the point I brought up earlier, where is it even possible to live a virtuous life? I'm teaching the sacraments right now to my students. And before we jumped into the sacraments, we read an excerpt from St. Augustine's Confessions. Have you read the Confessions before?
Mm-hmm.
So the Confessions by St. Augustine, it's basically, he wrote it post-conversion to Catholicism, but it summarizes his whole conversion story. And he's talking about his evil deeds, his sins, and how he overcame really what he struggled with was lust, the vice of lust. And there's a scene in this garden of his where he kind of has a mental breakdown. You can clearly read the narrative. He's like talking to his friend, and Augustine just gets up, becomes kind of hysterical, and just runs out of the house. And his friend follows him and is kind of like keeping an eye on him to make sure he doesn't like go crazy and like jump off a cliff or something. And Augustine just breaks down, and he kind of comes to grip with the fact that he can't fight his lustful desires. And it is when he admits that he can no longer do it, that he's like, it's just not an option for me. That's when he actually begins to overcome it.
Yep.
He doesn't give into it. He just admits that he can't do it. And I think that's true about virtue. Because you and I, while we were talking at Burger Habit or whatever, Habit Burger, becoming a good person can be very, very frustrating. Or trying to pursue the good can be very frustrating.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking of times where I think to myself, okay, how do I be a good parent? How do I direct my children towards the good? And you think, okay, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. And you have it all mapped out. And then you execute the plan, and then your kid objects in a way you did not anticipate. And then you get frustrated at your kid, and then you yell at the kid. Now, does that look virtuous? There's a time to raise your voice with your children for sure, but it doesn't look so good. There are times where it's not appropriate and you look weak. But you think to yourself, but I'm trying to do a good thing, so it makes it okay. No. Like I was telling Peter, I'm reading this book by Father Jacques Philippe, Searching for and Maintaining Peace. Really short book. Every sentence is a one-liner that is worthy of just thinking and pondering upon. And he talks about this idea of people think that they're living a good life because they're pursuing good things, but they're anxious all the time. They're angry all the time. And you see this with like a lot of Christians.
Yeah.
They're just, and I definitely fall into this trap where I'm just angry with the world nonstop. Like, I can't believe the way the world is, you know? Like, I'm 8 years old, and I sound like a 45-year-old conservative who only watches Fox News, you know? I can't believe this is nuts. And that doesn't seem like a Christian life. It does not seem like the Christian life of just, like, being angry all the time and being frustrated with the world. Father Jacques Philippe says, if that's how you are, that means you're probably pursuing virtue in the wrong way. Yes, you're pursuing the right thing. That's great. But you're doing it in the wrong way.
Yeah.
And I think one way to guarantee that you're doing it the wrong way is by doing it all on your own. It's actually like going back to the analogy of being a parent. The bad way to be a parent, the wrong way to be a parent is to think that you have what it takes to be a good parent.
Yeah.
100%. I 100% do not have that ability.
Yeah.
And acknowledging that and entrusting your children to God's care is when that suddenly becomes possible, and fear steps aside. And when you remove fear, you're less likely to get angry and agitated, and you're less anxious, because fear is not of God. Anxiety is not of God.
Yeah.
And once that's creeping in, you know you're doing something wrong, or maybe you're dealing with something too that needs to be addressed spiritually. But so it seems to be the case to be happy, to live, to be a good person is to live a virtuous life.
Yeah.
We need God for some reason. which maybe we could talk about that a little bit more. Like, why do we need God? You talked about it a little bit more, but maybe we could unpack it some more. Just think about that. And what does that look like? What is God's role in our happiness? That there's something like, obviously it's becoming dependent upon God, and he's going to lead us towards the good. But what, there's a lot more to be said there, I feel like, about God being the good. Wouldn't you agree?
Wait, so what do you mean by what is God's role in our happiness? I just want to understand that a little bit more.
That is more of a question. Like, what is God's role?
No, I know, but I mean, what are you asking about? I know it sounds stupid, but for some reason I'm not following exactly what that question means.
There's three characters in this play. It's us, happiness, and God.
Okay.
And what is each other's role? Like, our role is clearly to try and become happy.
Yes.
But I would argue that God and happiness are the same thing in this play.
God and
he's everything, actually.
Fulfillment, joy, eudaimonia, happiness are the same thing. Yes.
Yeah.
Like, I would agree.
Yeah, God
happiness in the modern emotional sense is not the same per se as God or as eudaimonia, though, either. That's the thing.
Yeah, maybe we should
That's an important distinction to make, I think, is that we've used the word, and I've used it myself, the word happiness several times. It's important to understand that Aristotle's concept of eudaimonia, like that's why I keep saying, like, happiness in a more ecstatic, existential, like, joy type sense, is that it's deeper than the emotion of happiness.
Well, yeah, maybe we should talk about that. Yeah, so maybe you could expand a little bit more on what the modern understanding of happiness is, and then what happiness really is.
Well, I think what I would say about that is just that the modern understanding of happiness, and there's nothing wrong with it as long as it's understood well, is that it's an emotion, just like sadness, anger, frustration. Those are all things that we can feel, which are good. Like, feelings are good. That's part of how we're created. But they're all things that they can come as kind of reactions to things. And I think an important distinction to draw there maybe is that the emotion of happiness in the modern sense is often linked with pleasure. And pleasure is not necessarily pleasure is a good thing, but it also can be used to an excess, which happens a lot in our world today, that people pursue pleasure rather than pursuing true happiness. And I think that's the thing, is that happiness in the emotional sense can come from pleasure. Now, I would also say that I think happiness in the emotional sense, I would probably say, could also come from things that aren't necessarily like pleasure in the purely pleasureful, like when I say pleasure right now, I'm thinking of like, you have a really tasty burger, or you have a really good, dessert, a really good, bowl of ice cream or something like that, or a really good drink of alcohol. And you're like, wow, this gives me this like happiness because it gives me a good feeling, in this like pleasure sense. And that's good as long as it's not taken to excess. That's a good thing. But you could also say that like doing a charitable work, like we were talking about earlier, could bring you a sense of happiness. But I would say that sense of happiness is oftentimes a little bit different than the pleasure of, a good drink, or a good, sweet or whatever. And so that's good. But then I think the other distinction to draw is that Aristotle's concept of happiness, at least as I understand it, I could be corrected by, someone who's more of an Aristotelian scholar than me, but I've done enough reading of Aristotle and classwork and stuff that my perception of Aristotle's reading of happiness would be that happiness in the eudaimonia sense, that Greek word is specifically, why it's so specific is because it's something more than the pleasure form of happiness. It's not the emotion of happiness. It's like the deep joy almost might be a better thing to equate it to, because even though people talk about joy sometimes in an emotional sense, joy in the truest sense of what it is actually deeper than an emotion. Joy is kind of like when Rhys was just talking about the book Searching for and Maintaining Peace by Father Jacques Philippe. Joy would be something that, like, if you have that sense of peace, it can also come with joy because it's this more profound sense. It's more of like an overall experience than it is just an emotion. It's not something you feel and then you can, feel the different emotions on all different. You could have joy and be sad, because sadness is an emotion and joy is a deeper sense of like the good. And so I think that that's an important distinction, that Aristotle's sense of eudaimonia is almost more equatable with joy, in the sense of that form of ecstasy, that final end. And that's where the link to God for me comes in, that the only true happiness, like St. Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologiae talks about happiness with God in the end, in this like final sense of happiness. Again, not in a simple emotional sense, but in the more profound sense of happiness with God in heaven. And so that's like the joy, the happiness that we should be pursuing in eudaimonia. That's like St. Thomas Aquinas often took Aristotelian things and just kind of put a Christian lens on them, basically. And in a sense, I would say that's kind of like him putting a Christian lens on the eudaimonia concept in one sense. So that's how I would distinguish that. Do you have thoughts about that or questions or?
Yeah, no. Also, like the modern understanding of happiness, which is basically sensorial, correct?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
it's
like
based on the
feel.
senses. Yeah, what you feel.
There's also something neuroscientifically problematic with that, in which if happiness is based off of a feeling, the way it works, so the concept of dopamine, right? And dopamine isn't really, people view it as a reward hormone. It's really more of a motivating hormone. Dopamine is the thing you experience right before you receive the good thing. So dopamine is the excitement you experience when you're watching a sport, like a game, and someone's about to make the winning shot. It's like where you hold your breath. That's why even if the shot gets missed, you still get this release of like happiness, energy, even though you're displeased with like what happened. Like you watch a crowd react to a missed shot, and they still go, oh, like they still let out this thing.
Yeah.
And it keeps them motivated as long as the game's still going to like keep watching, keeps them excited. But the problem with that is we all have kind of a base level of dopamine of like what makes us feel good enough.
Yeah.
But we can increase that base level to an unhealthy level. So for example, did we talk about this during the first episode? Do you remember me talking about dopamine?
I don't think so.
Okay. So if, let's say I gave you a button.
If we did, I apologize to everyone.
So let's say I gave you a button. I heard this from someone else. And every time you push the button, I gave you $5. Okay.
Okay.
You push it 5 times and I give you $5 every time you push it. Then you push it a 6th time and I give you $20. That's going to feel much better than the 5, right?
Yeah.
And then you push it a 7th time, I give you another 20. You push it an 8th time, I give you another 20. But then you push it the 9th time and I go back to giving you 5.
Then I'm going to be upset.
The joy you experienced when you received the $5 bill for the first time was much greater than the
happiness,
time you
I would say,
received it.
but yeah.
Yeah, the happiness. Yeah, the happiness you experienced when you received the $5 bill the first time was much greater than the happiness you experienced. You actually experienced disappointment the time you released it after the $20 bill because I increased your dopamine level. And so the way we increase our dopamine base level, and the way we increase that is through stimuli. So we feel good when we listen to music. Or like the analogy that I was given is like we go on a walk and we feel good. But nowadays we don't just go on a walk. We decided to start going on walks while listening to music. But now we don't just go on walks and listen to music. We go on walks, listen to music, and then watch videos on our phone while we're walking. And that's just insane. Like, there are some TikToks. I do not have TikTok. I want that to go on the record. Okay. There are some TikToks where there's 2 videos going on at the same time. Where like the top, like the screen is split in half, and in the top someone's explaining something, and on the bottom screen someone's like cooking food. It's so you can watch something entertaining while listening to someone, but also see them at the same time.
What?
It's nuts. It's because,
oh my gosh,
and it totally makes sense because our dopamine levels, our base level is getting higher and higher. So in order to keep our attention, we have to do these crazier things. But we're eventually gonna something's going to happen. Like eventually we're just going to crap out and be like, this is as high as it gets. And now everything is boring. You see? So clearly the sensorial view of happiness is just not neurologically healthy.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, for sure.
Like it's good in and of itself because the feeling of pleasure when ordered properly is good. Like you said, it's good to have a drink.
And because pleasure comes out of, like, I think you could argue that from a Christian perspective, you could argue that God gave us pleasure as a way of encouraging us in good actions. That like a lot of good actions will give you a sense of pleasure. But again, it's that thing of that's where the virtue aspect comes in. That do we then just pursue those things for the sake of having that good feeling, that dopamine hit? Or do we acknowledge that this thing gave me pleasure as a good reward in a sense for something I did that is good, but that's not what I'm pursuing for the sake of that. It's just a nice like side effect or a secondary kind of aspect of it. It's an incidental aspect of it, not the reason for it.
And going back to the self-help craze, like they're answering this dopamine question. There are things nowadays called dopamine fasts where you just don't stimulate yourself at all for like a day or something. And then that resets your level. And then you can go back to doing what you normally do and it still brings you joy. And sure, that fixes that for a little bit. But first of all, not too many people are willing to do that, nor do they have a time for a dopamine fast. Okay. And second of all, we're going to eventually get to the point where we ask the question, okay, but why the hell are we doing any of this?
Yeah.
So, and that's why we need this different understanding of happiness. Eudaimonia, not
Eudaimonia.
We need this fulfillment. Yeah.
Yeah.
That happens outside of in a sense, like because of causes outside of ourselves, not causes, but like
relationships
outside of ourselves.
Yeah.
And so happiness, there's the world's understanding of happiness, which is good, but incomplete.
Yes.
But then there's this Aristotelian religious also understanding of happiness that seems to be more it's all encompassing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think if we're just obsessed with the sensorial, we're going to be left very disappointed.
Well, and one of the aspects that I think is important to acknowledge about that as well is that if you take it from the Christian perspective of happiness, it's not fully attainable this side of heaven. So the way that Aquinas talks about it is that fullest sense of happiness we can only get to if we make it to heaven. And so when you think about it, the pursuit of happiness, the pursuit of happiness in this life will always run short of the end. Just like we were talking about how no one can live perfect virtue in this life. In the same way, no one can attain full happiness in this life. And I think that's one of the other like sad flaws to me about our world today is that I think there's a lot of people out there who unintentionally, I don't think that most people explicitly think of it this way, but I think there's a lot of people who are pursuing like the fullness of happiness. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like in a certain sense, we should be pursuing the fullness of happiness with the understanding that that's not going to come this side of heaven.
Yeah.
But
kind of like
I think a lot of people are trying to see if they can make the fullness of happiness happen on earth. And the way that they go about that, to the point you just made about the dopamine thing, is by trying to get as much pleasure as they can. Yeah. Because that's the only sensory way that we can receive a lot of happiness on this side of heaven, is through those pleasurable sensory dopamine hits. And so then like, oh, well, I want to get to this fullness of happiness, so I'm just going to do a bunch of things that are going to make me feel good.
I think we need to have a podcast on the concept of heaven.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people, if you ask them, like, what's heaven going to be like? Like, it's just going to be like one crazy party, man, just like nonstop. It's like, well, yeah, no, but not like an earthly party. You know, it's not going to be just for eternity. You know, it's... I think I'm trying to. I think we need to.
Not quite like that.
No, because Aristotle, when he talks about happiness or virtue, because becoming virtuous sucks. Like it's very difficult. It's like exercise.
And again, you can see that from even the secular people like Jocko Willink and Goggins and all them who pursue virtue. Like they talk about how painful it is, how hard it is.
It doesn't sound like pleasure.
It's not, it's not fun in that sense. Like you notice they don't talk about how much they enjoy doing, like they do in a certain sense, but what I mean is they describe how difficult those things are.
Yeah. Well, but eventually though, you get to the point where you find joy in those things. Like Goggins is crazy because he's like, I like to suffer. Like he actually, like I'm convinced that he enjoys suffering. Like
Yeah,
like
but
like
I mean,
properly ordered suffering.
I was going to say, like, in an interesting sense, though, like from a Christian point of view, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because
No, it's not.
we're
a
all
bad thing,
going
no.
to have suffering, and part of it is acknowledging that it's okay to, not, there's evils in the world, obviously, like awful diseases and cancer and whatever else, but like at the same time, suffering is something we're going to encounter, and if our reaction to that is, oh, this is awful, I hate it, I'm just going to run away from this, that's not going to help anybody. Versus, we were just talking at Habitburger about when Cardinal Sarah came to the U.S. a couple years ago and gave a talk here in Baltimore, and somebody asked him a question about suffering, and his immediate response was, suffering is good. And it was, now obviously there's nuance to that, and his point was, he elaborated on that very clearly. His point was not to say like, oh, you should go seek out suffering, but the point is that suffering can be a redemptive suffering. That's something we could have a whole podcast on too. But suffering can be a good thing that can allow for us to grow. And we can get to the point of Goggins, like you're saying, where we almost like enjoy it in a weird sort of sense. Like there's a sense in which you can understand how that would make sense.
Well, I think this relates really well to what Aristotle taught, because he talks about 4 stages of the virtuous life, or four types of people who have a relationship with virtue. There's the vicious person. Mm-hmm. And what is the vicious person? The vicious person takes no joy in virtue. Like, imagine someone who's a womanizer and suddenly placing them in a house with a family. They're not going to be happy. Mm-hmm. Because they're like, whoa, like, sure, maybe I want this one day, but I'm like clearly in no state. Like, I was doing this instead. I'd rather be doing this, So the vicious person does not find joy in the good. But Aristotle also would argue that the vicious person doesn't even know they don't know the good. They can't even discern between good and bad anymore because they're so corrupted by vice. And not only that, so they wouldn't find joy in it. They don't choose it, and they also can't choose it because they don't know what it is. Then there's the incontinent person. The incontinent person knows what is good, but they don't choose what is good because they don't find pleasure in what is good. Then there's the continent person. The continent person knows what is good. They choose what is good, but they don't yet take a lot of joy in choosing the good thing. And I find myself kind of at that level,
Yeah, I think oftentimes a lot of us are at that level.
Yeah, like I've really started going to daily mass, and it's at 6:30 in the morning, and I've been very tired. It's exhausting. Or we're about to start Exodus 90.
Exodus 90,
and we're going to do things that suck.
Yep.
But they're virtuous things. And it's because we haven't developed the habit muscle of doing those things that it's going to be exhausting initially.
Yeah.
And probably the whole time, honestly. And then the last person, a truly virtuous person, Aristotle says, is someone who knows the good, does the good, but also takes joy in doing the good. Like, and I think there are parts of my life where I'm at that level, but not all. Like, I would feel gross taking $100 bill off the ground and not turning it in, like outside of a bank or something.
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe if I was in the woods, maybe I'd be like, there's no way anyone's going to find this. You know what I mean? But maybe part of me would feel bad. But there are things that some people would find easy to do that aren't necessarily bad, but are clearly not good. That would just make me feel a little like upset in the stomach.
Yeah.
Where I'm like, I don't find joy
and I think
in doing the bad thing.
If I may use this is a very basic example of it, but I think you can correct me if you think this isn't an example of it, but I think this is a very just basic human example of it in one sense, is that a few years ago when I entered seminary, I was used to be really overweight, and then I was like kind of overweight, and I realized I wanted to get healthier and start eating better and exercising, all that. And that journey required a lot of the things you're talking about, where initially I started running, for example, for the first time, and it was sucked. It was hard. The other thing that I think is probably the best example to me of this, in a sense, is growing up, I hated Brussels sprouts. They were like my least favorite vegetable. Now, part of that is because I only ever ate them when they were just literally boiled in water with nothing, and so they just tasted gross. But either way, didn't like them. I now love Brussels sprouts. And it's kind of, I know this seems silly in some ways, but it's an example almost of what you're talking about, in the sense that what happened is when I started getting healthier, I was looking into various different foods to eat and like healthy vegetables and stuff like that. And I realized like, oh, Brussels sprouts are a really healthy green vegetable. They have a lot of fiber and other things. Okay, so I'm going to try having some Brussels sprouts, even if I don't like them. And over time, I started eating them more. And it was kind of that like continent thing in a certain sense initially of like, well, I think this is a good thing for me, and I'm going to keep doing it, even though I don't particularly get joy in it. And then the more that I had them and the more that they like helped me to get healthier, the more I eventually got to the point. I know this is a really silly example.
No, but it makes sense.
But it kind of makes sense that the more I got to the point where eventually I am now at a point where I actually really like Brussels sprouts. Now, granted, I've also now since then I've learned like fun ways to cook Brussels sprouts where you can make them taste really good, which makes it even better. But even I'm going to reveal something really weird about me. But even
Great.
I will literally sometimes, just for the sake of health, heat up a bag of frozen Brussels sprouts and eat like half of it, just because it like makes me feel good, and like not makes me feel good in a like sensory pleasure sense. It ain't like that, because eating just like plain Brussels sprouts does not taste good in that sense. But it does bring me a sense of like fulfillment in a good way, in an even more than continent way, because I'm like, this is good for me and I want it. And it like actually, like I desire it in a weird sort of way. And so that's kind of my point is, again, it's a very silly, weird example, but it's kind of the point. It's almost like going along those lines of the four things you just said, from like viciously hating Brussels sprouts to then like, you know, eventually getting to the continent point where it's like, all right, I'm going to have some of these because I think they're good for me, but I don't enjoy it at all. To now it's like, the virtuous thing of like, I actually think these are good for me. Now, again, I know that's a silly example, but the point is that puts a little bit of concreteness on what you were saying. And
Yeah,
I think
for sure.
I think your point is very good of like, that's how we should be trying to live virtue in general. And I think most major things that I'm trying to grow in virtue in, if I'm anywhere good on them, I'm in that continent level a lot of the time right now, that I don't think there's probably some things I could think of, but off the top of my head, it's hard for me to think of things where I'm like, really at that virtuous point that Aristotle talks about, where I actually enjoy doing that thing.
Right. Yeah, no, I would agree. And so when you're trying to live this good life and be a good person, these are the stages we're going to move through and go in and out of, obviously.
Yeah.
But that journey is impossible unless we have that end goal set in mind. Like Aristotle said, that teleological end goal, or that teleological mindset. What am I working towards? What is my purpose? And like he said, it is fulfillment. Okay.
Yeah.
But I think we still have, I think we did a good job of talking about what happiness is and how to get there, but ultimately we're going to find our happiness in God.
Yeah.
Now, why do you think that theologically, I think we could say the reason God will make us happy is because he's our maker.
Okay.
He's our creator. And only through fulfilling the design put into us by our creator can we be happy. And that's consistent with, I think this is like a version of, as you were mentioning, St. Thomas Aquinas' Christianization of Aristotle's teachings.
Yeah.
It's a teleological understanding. Like, think about it. If my phone, it's designed to make calls, text, and also distract me. But if I use it as a hammer, it's going to break.
Yeah.
Why? Because the teleological nature of my phone is to be used for communication and entertainment, or certain types of communication and certain types of entertainment. It is not meant to be used as a hammer. When I violate its nature, it gets destroyed and arguably ceases to exist. So a Christian teleological understanding of human beings is we are made by God and for God. And when we deviate from that path, we're like a phone being used as a hammer.
Correct.
We're going to break and we are going to destroy ourselves, which is definitely happening with a lot of us nowadays.
Yep.
Now, that presupposes that God exists, and we're not trying to get into like arguments for God's existence. And we've already made the point that using God as the end goal has clearly proven helpful throughout history. And once you remove God, it just doesn't go well. People try to play God themselves, and it just doesn't work out. And getting people just to be virtuous for the sake of being virtuous doesn't work out either, because people have their own ideas of what is good and what is bad.
Mm-hmm.
But do you think that there's more to say about why God is necessary for a virtuous life? We talked about that we need his help as well.
No, I mean, I think the two fundamental things to that, just to kind of reiterate and to use a classic definition, is that we, obviously I said we were created for a relationship with God, but to be more clear to the point you made about things being used for their proper end, we as human beings were created to know, love, and serve God. And so therefore, if we don't know, love, and serve him, then our end is being distorted in a sense. And so that's where you get to that. And then of course there's also the help aspect that we talked about. So those are kind of the two sides of that, of how God relates to virtue, I would say.
What do you think about the necessity for an eternal element to our happiness?
What do you mean by, like, you mean what I was saying about the fact that happiness can't be fulfilled except in heaven? Is that what you're saying? Or
I'm saying if there's no eternal option for happiness, couldn't you just make the argument that there's still no point to it?
Why would there not be an eternal option to happiness? What do you mean?
Like, because people are going to listen to us and say, okay, I can see how God is helpful for happiness. And I can see how you can make the argument that thinking that you're receiving help from God to be virtuous causes you to be less stressed and therefore more likely to be calm and therefore more likely to think clearly to be virtuous. But those are just tricks to get you to be happy. I think also, unless you think that being happy eternally is an option, or you're not going to care. You're not going to truly ever be happy. If you subscribe to the idea that we use God as a tool to make our lives happy, but if we really think deep down inside, when I die, that's it, I think people are going to give up on trying to be happy.
Well, I think I agree with you, and I think but again, I think that's what we see in our world today.
Oh, for sure.
Because I think that's kind of my point. That's why I tried to draw that distinction between happiness in the eternal sense and happiness in the simple emotion pleasure sense. Because when you think about it, look at what a lot of people in the world are pursuing today. Are they pursuing a deep sense of happiness? No, they're going from one pleasure to another. Mm-hmm. And I don't say that to try to be flippant or to try to be mean to people, but I think that it's very clear when you look at, you examine a lot of what people do in the world nowadays.
Just pause. The HVAC system started.
Yeah, I know.
I'll pause it. You keep talking. I'll turn it off, actually. I'm going to pause it, actually, real quickly.
So, yeah, I just think the world today, you see it a lot with this thing of people jumping from one pleasure to another. And I think that's the distinction, really, is that they're not really pursuing, because they don't have the telos in mind of God and of true happiness being in heaven. They just inadvertently, again, I'm not saying it to be mean to them, but they just inadvertently, a lot of people end up kind of pursuing pleasure. And that's why I make that distinction between like the happiness of pleasure versus that higher level of happiness.
Yeah, I think also, even if like this is what I look at Jordan Peterson. I also look at Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, and they teach these great lessons, but they're taught without God, kind of. Like Peterson, not like half yes, half no, but Viktor Frankl was definitely taught, like his lessons were taught in like absent of God. They're good in and of themselves, but and same with Aristotle, actually. But if there's no eternal element to it, eventually the person's going to ask why. Like, why do these things? Like, yes, they make me a better person. They make me feel more complete. But unless I get to experience this for eternity, and it's just going to end, that kind of sours this entire experience. Like I think, might have been Tolstoy who wrote this short story about a man who was being chased by this beast, and he jumps into a well to get away from the beast. Mm-hmm. And he's hanging. Have you heard of this? He's hanging. He didn't fall into the well. He's inside of it. He's kind of like hanging on the edge, but he's just deep enough into the well. He's not on the edge, but he's deep enough into the well that the beast can't get to him. But he looks down, and at the bottom of the well is like this alligator or dragon beast that's ready to consume him. So he can't get out of the well, but he also can't fall down.
Yeah.
And he's hanging upon a twig, and the twig is like breaking. And on a leaf of the twig is honey. And the person eats the honey, and it tastes bitter. And the point of that story is the joys of life become bitter when death is confronted, or when death is at your door, when the abyss of nothingness is before you. So if you're living a life with all these great joys, but when you die, nothing happens,
So
it doesn't matter.
okay, so I guess my only sorry, I can be like this sometimes, but I guess my only distinction that I would draw with that would be, would you be okay with me replacing what you just said as joy with pleasure, like the pleasures of life fall apart? Because I would be hesitant to call those joys, because the joy of life in the context of the Christian life, even when you do face the abyss, the joy of life should still be there in the joy sense,
Right,
of
because you
proper
know
joy.
because
But that's different than like the pleasures of life, like honey, like something sweet that is a physical sensory pleasure, is not going to be pleasurable when you think about eternity in the abyss in that sense.
well, the point I'm trying to make is not really a difference between sensual pleasures and true joy and fulfillment. What I'm saying is if it's all just going to end, there's no point to experiencing anything. There's no point in being a good person if when you die, that's it.
Yeah. But you're not saying that's a good thing, right?
No.
You're saying
I'm
that,
not
like,
saying no.
So you're saying that in Tolstoy's thing, there's no eternal life.
Yeah, in Tolstoy's, he's saying that death sours everything. I think it's one of the reasons.
But death sours everything because there's no eternal life, because it's just the end.
And like a death in which when you die, that's it.
Okay.
Yeah. Clearly, in the Christian lens, when you die, that's just the beginning of the story. To be honest with you. But a lot of people don't subscribe to that. They think when you die, that's it, and this is the life you've got, and you just got to make the most of it. But making the most of it, Tolstoy would say, is just pointless. You can't make the most out of bitterness. Like, it's just still bitter, and you might as well just not even experience it. And that's when you get into a very nihilistic worldview. And I hear people object to this all the time, and they say, yeah, but no one actually lives like that. And I'm like, there are plenty of people living like that. A lot of them shoot people up in buildings, you know what I mean, and end up taking their lives. Like, it's just, to say that that's not happening is just completely ignorant to history.
That what's not happening?
That just people are not living truly nihilistically.
Oh, yeah.
It's just ignorant
absolutely.
of history. But I think people who say that they don't have to live nihilistically are also young, and their body has yet to break down. Remember how the point we made earlier about, we can live virtuous, but once your body starts to break down, you have to find joy in like giving yourself to others even. But even then, the abyss distorts that.
And I
care
think,
about others.
I think to your point from earlier about that maybe it would be worth at some point going into a more in-depth discussion of heaven, even though I do think we have to be careful sometimes about talking about heaven, but it could be worth it on some level, because I think one of the things that I would propose about the world today, though, is that I think a lot of people, because we live in kind of an interesting post-Christian society, especially here in the West, I think a lot of people do actually have some inherent sense of eternal life that they wouldn't, like, I think if you ask a lot of like people who are, fallen away Catholics or Christians or whatever, who don't really practice any religion right now, I don't think most of them would deep down tell you that they believe there's nothing after death.
Yeah.
But I think the deeper problem that we have right now is that a lot of those people believe that they're just gonna go to heaven, basically, in this like childish way of not recognizing that, like, to actually achieve, maybe that's not the right word to use, but to actually like gain the fullness of heaven, to actually get to that point, requires us cooperating with God's grace and living a virtuous life. It isn't merely like, oh, just live the life you want to live, be the good you want to do, and then you'll just get to heaven and everything will be fun at that point. Like,
when you do what you want to do, you get cast from the garden.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that's a thing that to me is actually a much deeper issue in our world today than even like the belief that there is nothing after death. Like, I think that's actually, I would argue that the belief there's nothing after death is actually less common than the like presumption that everyone's just going to be in this happy heaven place regardless of what they do on earth.
I think we should look into some studies of that. That'd be interesting. How many people think
Like what
nothing?
the differences are.
Like
yeah.
how many people are atheists, and how many people think there's an afterlife, and compare the numbers.
Well, to be honest though too, we should look into that. I'm also just saying on like a more practical level, because like there's that classic thing that like there are some actual atheists out there who really believe there is no God. But when you really dig down to it in conversations with a lot of people who are like agnostic, let's say, most of them deep down will say that like they think there's something out there and that there's probably some sort of eternity or something. They just don't care that much and don't want to think about it because that's just not really their thing.
There's a lot of baggage with it.
Yeah.
Like, this is how I live a good life. Yeah. And I don't get to do what I want to do.
Yeah. Well, and that gets back to that thing about virtue, that like one of the things that all of, you and I and so many we know who live like, who attempt to live somewhat virtuous lives, it is not easy. And it requires a lot of sacrifice and a lot of pain in a certain sense that is purifying and is good, but a lot of people don't want to have to deal with that especially today.
I think that's why a lot of people aren't having kids anymore, actually, in the Western world. Because I have kids, and it's exhausting. It is. Having a family is not for someone who only wants to live for themselves.
Yeah.
100%. If you just want to serve yourself, don't ever have kids.
Yeah.
Now, I think maybe having kids might force you to change your mind on that. But having kids is exhausting. I don't have a lot of freedom. You and I recorded our first episode 2.5 months ago.
I think it was like a month and a half or 2 months ago. But yeah, it was a while ago. Because Blaze was born already.
Yeah. And so like that was... Yeah, he was born and it's still been a month and a half. And then we finally just did our second episode.
Yeah.
And it's because we just haven't had the time.
Yeah.
And it's like that with a lot of things in my life. So, yeah, if you want to live a life for yourself, don't have kids, man. Just do whatever you want. And hopefully you live a happy life, which I know you won't.
Yeah.
You just won't. But... yeah, and that's another problem on its own, just people not having families anymore.
Well, and I think you're absolutely right, and I think that is something that actually is directly related to this conversation about virtue, though, is the element of sacrifice that's involved, too. That to sacrifice, again, that whole thing about charity and everything that we were talking about earlier, like to live virtue requires doing things for the sake of others at times, and that requires making an actual sacrifice.
Yeah.
And sacrificing, involves inherently not being able to do certain things that might bring us pleasure or happiness in some way or another.
Yeah, it seems, to truly be happy. And maybe there's something to learn from the Buddhist here. Because the Buddhist approach is there is suffering in the world, and how do we deal with it? Like, that's the big question in Buddhism. There's suffering in the world, and how do we deal with it? And Buddhism answers that question by saying, basically, and I don't mean to straw man, I'm just trying to simplify. There's much deeper, there's many deeper ways to describe Buddhism, but it's just don't expect anything and you'll be fine.
Well, and I think we have that in our Christian mysticism too, because St. John of the Cross, who was, one of the references to this is actually that movie you were talking about.
Yeah.
the man who became Pope, but St. John of the Cross, and I've read St. John of the Cross myself, but
nice.
But he says multiple times in different ways that if we want to attain all, we must desire nothing.
I remember hearing that line specifically.
And like, that's such a weird paradox, but it's so true too. That like the more that we desire to give up of ourselves, to empty ourselves in a sense, because that's something that the East uses a lot, like that emptying concept. But that's also true in like Christian mysticism, that if we allow ourselves to be emptied of ourselves in a certain sense, then we can be filled up with God.
Yeah.
And
Buddhism is just Buddhism is just empty everything. But Christianity
says empty everything so that you can be filled with God.
Yeah.
Who will be your ultimate fulfillment and will fill you and will give you that deep desire. And that's the beauty of like that phrase of like to attain all is to desire nothing, like to try to give up everything to get the world, like, and it's kind of the perfect inverse too of the line from scripture, I think it is, right? Of like, oh my gosh, why am I blanking on this all of a sudden? The like to like to give up your soul to attain the world or whatever.
Why would you gain the whole world and lose
your soul? Yeah. That like, that like it's almost like the opposite of that we should be trying to gain nothing of the world in a certain sense in order to fill ourselves up. That doesn't mean we don't interact with the world. It doesn't mean we don't live in the world.
Yes.
But just to not be trying to fill ourselves with the world.
Yeah, that's definitely something I need to work on. Because I can see so many ways in my life in which I am consumed with filling myself up with joy, and not necessarily the right type of joy.
Well, if you're gonna be doing Exodus 90 with us coming up, then don't worry, it'll help with that. I've done it several times now, and it definitely helps.
I wasn't sure about it, but then like I was reading the email, it's like, you want to get off your phone? I'm like, yes. All right, sick. There you go. That's good enough for me.
Yeah.
Do I have to do the cold showers?
Dude, the cold showers are one of the most purifying things. I've
been doing cold showers for like a year, but just there are a few days where I let myself, I'm like, okay, I need a warm shower this morning.
Oh, see, I try to avoid that because I know I'm weak, and if I've been doing cold showers ever since, well, this past year I've been doing it very consistently since I did Exodus, so about a year now. And like, I do take warm showers every now and then, but I try to avoid it as much as possible because I'm weak. And if I take a warm shower once, then I want it more times. Like that dopamine thing we were talking about in a certain sense, that like I get that like, oh, this is nice. And then it's like, oh, I want to do this again the next day. And it makes the cold showers a million times harder.
Have you ever taken a cold shower and then turned it on warm?
I have, actually. Yeah.
The first time I did that was exhilarating.
Was it? See, I actually find that like, I mean, wait, I guess it depends what you mean by exhilarating, because I actually find that really uncomfortable in a weird sort of good way, but like it actually doesn't make the warm shower feel good to me because you just went drastically cold to warm.
Which I hear isn't super
and so your
healthy to
body's
do.
like, oh, I don't want either of these. Like, this is gross. Like,
I did it once and like I felt like I got this massive rush of energy. It was wild. I don't know. It hasn't happened since. I'm sure it was like the first time someone does heroin, and
maybe not.
Never done heroin.
Yeah,
Don't
I was
do
gonna
it.
say I would not recommend that, but I've not done that myself.
I just the first floor of my work where I spend 90% of my time is so cold. I teach in an old building like most Catholic schools do, and there's just no heat down there. So I'm cold all day. And so I was like, just a little bit of warmth would be nice. But yeah, no, it'll be good. It'll be good to suffer. So I think there's still a lot more to talk about. Maybe not necessarily now.
We can put a cap on it for now.
But what does it mean to be a good person? To live a life in accordance with the good? What does that look like? It means being virtuous, to use reason to tame our animalistic desires, not to discredit or not to just completely neglect them, but to give them what they need, but in a healthy amount.
Yeah.
And this will lead us to fulfillment as long as it's ordered towards the ultimate good, which is God.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, because without God, there just never seems to be enough to inspire us, motivate us, and also help us simply just achieve the good, because it's not something we can do on our own.
Yeah.
Yeah. The idea that we can tame ourselves is like perfectly, it just seems a little foolish in a sense. So
exactly.
So yeah, and I'm sure we'll spend time talking about specific virtues on this podcast.
Yeah, I mean,
poverty,
absolutely.
chastity, obedience,
the evangelical counsels, yeah,
and faith, hope, and love. So awesome, wonderful.
Yeah. So I mean, I think going forward, we'll definitely dive into more details on some of these various different things we've talked about. But I think this is a good, like, these first 3 episodes, I think, have been a good kind of trilogy or trinity or whatever you want to call it, of getting us started on, understanding those 3 things of theism, existentialism, and nihilism, and then community and friendship, and what does that mean? And then, kind of like we talked about the top down in a sense, like those 3 views first at the top, and then community, friendship, and all that. And then now we've gotten into, like, on a personal level, on an individual level, what does it mean to, to live as a good person? What does it mean to pursue the good with virtue and God?
For sure. So Yeah, I mean, after this episode, we're hopefully going to post these at the beginning of the new year, 2025, right?
2024.
2024. Sorry, dude, if
you jumped
ask,
a year ahead.
If you ask me how old I am, like after I turned 21, and apparently a lot. Do you know how old? Like, of course, 30, you know how old you are, but like, well, 30 is gonna be easy to remember. But did you ever happen between like ages 21 and 30? You were like, wait, I'm 29. Or no, I'm 28. Do you ever have that happen? Where you
I usually just have to think about what year I was born and then figure out what year it is currently. That's usually what I have to do.
Yeah, but that's nuts that we even have to do that.
Well,
sometimes.
I know we should be able to remember, but it gets harder as you get older.
Well, it's just after 21, who cares?
Well, yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, 30 is like 30, and then
30.
40 is the next one that actually matters. Like,
right. But it's just I'm 28. Yeah, I'm 28. 95. Yeah, 28. Okay, there we go. So even years. So yeah, 2024. At the beginning of 2024, we'll start posting these. And
yeah, so I mean, this one probably won't come out till late January or early February or something. But
yeah. So if anyone is listening, which that'd be cool, we should by then have a website posted or an email posted where you can at least email questions.
We have an email already.
Yeah, we do have an email, but you don't have access to it. So when we post it, you guys will, like the listeners, they'll have access to it. So if you guys have something that you would like us to talk about or questions you want us to ask, or maybe you have some things you want to talk about and we could somehow interview you, you would have to have your own mic, of course, or live near us. And after a serious vetting process, we'd be happy to invite you into our homes to interview you. But we are of Mountains and Men. I am Rhys.
I am Peter.
You guys take care and God bless.